I think, Rose said slowly, some things are meant to be. Your grandmother saved my father's life. Years later, I got to help her family find their way home. It's like one of your math problems. Everything adds up in the end. Later that night, as they sat around Dr. Williams's dining table, the conversation turned to the future. The house had plenty of room for Beth and Annie. There was a good school nearby, and Dr. Williams had connections at several accounting firms in the area. Everything was falling into place. But you'll come visit us at the diner? Annie asked Rose anxiously. And we can come back to visit everyone too. Sweetheart, Dr. Williams said, reaching for her granddaughter's hand. That diner and the people in it will always be part of our family now. Sometimes the family you choose is just as important as the family you're born with. The small house sat at the end of a tree-lined street, its white exterior glowing in the afternoon sun. Rose parked the car but left the engine running, uncertain whether Beth and Annie would want her to come with them for this moment. The flower beds along the front walk were neatly tended, bursting with autumn colors. A wind chime tinkled softly on the porch. That's Grandma's wind chime, Annie whispered from the backseat. The one Dad gave her before. She trailed off, but her eyes were bright with recognition. She kept it. Beth sat frozen in the passenger seat, staring at the house. Her hands clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. I can't, she whispered. What if? Before she could finish, the front door opened. An elegant older woman stepped onto the porch, probably alerted by the sound of their car. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a medical bag, clearly just home from her volunteer work at the clinic. She looked toward their car with curious eyes, then stopped suddenly, her hand flying to her mouth. Mom? Beth's voice cracked. She fumbled with her seatbelt, nearly falling as she scrambled out of the car. Mom. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Dr. Williams dropped her medical bag, papers spilling across the porch. She practically flew down the front steps, her usual dignity forgotten in the rush to reach her daughter. They met halfway up the garden path, colliding in an embrace so fierce it looked almost painful. My baby, Dr. Williams sobbed, holding Beth's face between her hands. My precious girl. I've been looking everywhere for you. Annie climbed out of the car more slowly, clutching her grandmother's old notebook to her chest like a shield. When Dr. Williams saw her, she made a sound that was half laugh, half cry. Annie, is that my little mathematician? The girl nodded, suddenly shy. I kept your notebook, Grandma. I've been practicing all the math you taught me. Dr. Williams opened her arms wider, and Annie ran into them. The three of them stood there on the garden path, holding each other as years of pain and separation melted away in the warm autumn sunlight. Rose wiped tears from her eyes, feeling like both an intruder and a crucial witness to this miracle. Finally, Beth remembered her friend waiting in the car. Mom, she said, turning toward Rose. This is the woman who helped us find you. She's the waitress who saved my granddaughter, Dr. Williams finished, but then her eyes narrowed in recognition. No, wait. I know you from somewhere else. Rose stepped out of the car, suddenly nervous. 15 years ago, she said softly. Atlanta General. My father, room 302. The heart surgery nobody thought would work. Dr. Williams's eyes widened. The night shift case, she breathed. 7 hours in surgery. The daughter who brought me coffee and refused to give up hope. She looked between Rose and her family in amazement. You've been taking care of my girls. They took care of me too, Rose smiled. Annie's been teaching half the diner about mathematics. And Beth, she's the strongest person I know. What followed was an afternoon none of them would ever forget. They sat in Dr. Williams's cozy living room, sharing stories over cups of tea. The walls were covered with family photos, including many of Beth and Annie that had been taken before they left. Dr. Williams had never taken them down, keeping faith that her family would return. As the sun began to set, Dr. Williams insisted they all stay for dinner. While she and Beth worked in the kitchen, rebuilding their relationship over shared memories and quiet apologies, Annie gave Rose a tour of the house. The girl's eyes lit up at her grandmother's library, still filled with medical books and mathematical texts. Look, Annie exclaimed, pointing to a framed newspaper article. It showed a younger Dr. Williams standing next to a hospital bed where a smiling man gave a thumbs up to the camera. Rose's breath caught. It was her father after the successful surgery. As Rose drove home that night, her heart was full. The diner would feel different without Annie's daily math lessons and Beth's quiet presence, but she knew this wasn't an ending, it was a new beginning. Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come full circle, bringing healing not just to those who receive it, but to those who give it as well. And every time the bell above the diner door would ring, Rose would remember that rainy night when she first saw a hungry child in the window, and how that one small moment of compassion had changed so many lives forever. 3 hours. In 3 hours, they would complete a circle that had started 15 years ago in a hospital room. In 3 hours, a family torn apart by pride and circumstance would have a chance to heal. As the miles rolled by, Rose couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best navigators are the ones who have been lost themselves. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity at Jerry's dinner. Rose had called in every favor she could think of, reaching out to old friends in Atlanta, searching social media, and even contacting Atlanta General Hospital. But finding Dr. Williams proved more challenging than expected. She had retired from the hospital 3 years ago. Beth was hesitant when she first heard Rose's plan to locate her mother. "I don't know," she said quietly, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "We didn't exactly part on good terms. Mom wanted us to move in with her after everything fell apart, but I was too proud. Too stubborn." She looked down at her worn shoes. "I didn't want her to see me fail." "Mom," Annie said, reaching across the table to hold her mother's hand. "Grandma never thought you were a failure. Remember how she always said that stumbling isn't the same as falling." The diner's regular customers had all joined in the search effort. Mr. Thompson, who worked as a local newspaper editor, started making calls to his contacts in Atlanta. Mrs. Wilson used her retired teachers' network to spread the word. Even gruff old Joey had his truck driver friends keeping an eye out during their routes through Georgia. Then, on a cold Thursday morning, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the young busboys, while cleaning tables, overheard Rose talking about Dr. Williams and spoke up. "My aunt's a nurse at that hospital," he said. "She might know something." One phone call led to another, and suddenly they had an address. Dr. Williams had moved to a smaller town just outside Atlanta, where she volunteered at a free clinic 3 days a week. She was still helping people, still solving puzzles, just like Annie had said. Rose found Beth and Annie at their usual corner booth that evening, working on job applications. The hope in their eyes when she shared the news made her heart squeeze. "She's only 3 hours away," Rose said softly. "And according to the nurse I spoke with, she never stopped looking for you." Beth's hands trembled as she read the address Rose had written down. All this time, she whispered, she was so close. Annie wrapped her arms around her mother, and for a moment, they just held each other while Rose pretended to wipe down nearby tables to give them privacy. The diner's staff and regulars quickly put together a plan. Joey offered his sister's car for the trip, since Beth's old vehicle wasn't reliable enough for highway driving. Mrs. Wilson helped Beth prepare for the reunion, sharing her own story of reconciling with her son after years of silence. The locals even pulled together some money for gas and a new outfit for Beth's journey. "But what if she's angry?" Beth asked late that night after Annie had fallen asleep in the booth. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Rose sat down beside her friend, remembering the detailed notes in the medical notebook, the way Dr. Williams had checked on her father even during off hours. "A woman who cares that much about strangers could never stop loving her own daughter," she said firmly. "Sometimes we just need a little help finding our way back to each other." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Beth and Annie stood in the diner's parking lot, looking both excited and terrified. Rose had arranged to swap shifts so she could drive them. Something about this journey felt like her responsibility, a way to repay a 15-year-old debt. As they loaded their few belongings into Joey's sister's car, the diner's door kept opening and closing as people came out to wish them luck. Joey brought a box of freshly baked muffins for the road. Mrs. Wilson handed Annie a new notebook for all the stories you'll have to tell. Mr. Thompson gave Beth a letter of recommendation for job hunting in her new town. "Ready?" Rose asked, sliding behind the wheel. In the rearview mirror, she could see Annie clutching her grandmother's medical notebook, while Beth twisted her hands nervously in her lap. Just then, the diner's entire staff came outside, standing in a line to wave goodbye. These people who had started as strangers had become family, brought together by chance and held together by love. Joey's loud voice carried across the parking lot. Don't forget to come back and visit. Nobody makes grilled cheese like Annie. As they pulled onto the highway, Annie began reading aloud from her grandmother's notebook, sharing stories about difficult surgeries and lives saved. Beth listened quietly, tears rolling down her cheeks. Rose kept her eyes on the road, but her heart was full of hope. She thought about that rainy night when she'd first seen a hungry child outside her diner window, and how that one small moment had set in motion something so much bigger than herself. "Honey," Rose said, her determination growing stronger by the second, "after everything that's happened, I believe anything is possible. We just have to solve this puzzle, one step at a time, just like you taught me." The revelation came on a quiet Tuesday evening when the autumn rain drummed steadily against the diner's windows. Rose was helping Annie with her math homework, something that had become their routine during the slower hours of her shift. The girl's notebook lay open between them, filled with careful calculations and neat rows of numbers. "You know," Rose said, watching Annie solve a particularly tricky equation, "you remind me of someone. The way you think through problems, step by step." She smiled, remembering. "My dad used to say that good doctors are like mathematicians. They solve puzzles, just with people instead of numbers." Annie looked up, interested. "Your dad knew doctors?" "Oh yes," Rose nodded, refilling their hot chocolates. 15 years ago, he had a massive heart attack. We almost lost him." She paused, the memory still vivid. "But this amazing surgeon saved his life. She worked through the night, never gave up on him, even came to check on him during her off hours." The bell above the door chimed as a few customers hurried in from the rain. Rose stood to serve them, but Annie's voice stopped her. "What was the doctor's name?" "Dr. Williams," Rose replied, the name rolling off her tongue naturally. "She was at Atlanta General." She stopped suddenly, her eyes falling on Annie's grandmother's notebook. The name written in those margins. Dr. Patricia Williams, Atlanta General. The world seemed to slow down. Rose sank back into the booth, her hands trembling slightly. "Annie," she said carefully, "your grandmother's name, was it Patricia?" Annie nodded, pulling out the old notebook. "Yes, Dr. Patricia Williams. She was a heart surgeon at Atlanta General." She flipped through the pages, showing Rose the familiar handwriting. "Mom says she was one of the best surgeons they had." Rose's vision blurred with sudden tears. "October 12th, 2009, she whispered. "It was raining, just like tonight. Dad had collapsed at work. The ambulance took him to Atlanta General." Her voice trailed off as she stared at the notebook, at the precise handwriting she'd seen on her father's medical charts all those years ago. Annie's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Your dad, was he the patient in room 302? The one Grandma wrote about here?" She flipped to a specific page where detailed notes described a complicated heart surgery. "She used to tell me about this case, said it was one of her most challenging surgeries, but also one of her proudest moments." The diner seemed to fade away as Rose read the notes. There it was, her father's case, documented in the same careful handwriting that had filled out his discharge papers. The surgery that had given her family 15 more years with him. And now, here sat the granddaughter of that same remarkable woman, doing her homework in Rose's diner. "Does your mom know?" Rose asked softly. "About your grandmother's connection to this town." Annie shook her head. "Mom doesn't talk much about Atlanta anymore. After Dad left, things got really hard. Grandma tried to help, but Mom was too proud, too hurt. We left in the middle of the night. I don't think Grandma even knows where we are now." Joey appeared at their table, concern written on his face. He'd overheard enough to understand something important was happening. "Everything okay here?" he asked, setting down a plate of fresh-baked cookies that nobody had ordered. Rose wiped her eyes, managing a smile. "Joey, remember all those times I told you about the doctor who saved my dad's life? Well, meet her granddaughter." Joey's eyes widened as he looked between Rose and Annie. The girl sat straighter, a mix of pride and uncertainty on her face. "My grandma saved your dad," she whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it less true. "She did more than that," Rose replied, reaching across the table to squeeze Annie's hand. She gave our family hope when we thought all was lost. And now, 15 years later, I get to do the same for her granddaughter." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it? The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the diner, something magical was happening. Years of separation, missed connections, and twist of fate had led to this moment. As Rose looked at Annie, she saw not just the bright young girl she'd come to care for, but a living link to the woman who had given her family a second chance. "We need to find her," Rose said firmly. "Your grandmother. She needs to know where you are, that you're safe, that you're still the same brilliant girl who loves numbers and helps others just like she taught you to be." Annie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You really think we can find her?" The evening started like any other at Jerry's Diner, with the usual mix of truckers and locals seeking warm food and friendly faces. Rose was restocking sugar packets when Annie burst through the door, clutching a piece of paper in her hand, her eyes bright with excitement. "Look what I got on my math test," she exclaimed, nearly slipping on the freshly mopped floor in her enthusiasm. Rose caught her just in time, steadying her as Annie proudly displayed her paper. A bright red A+ marked the top of the page, accompanied by the teacher's note. "Exceptional work. Your problem-solving skills are remarkable." "I knew you could do it," Rose beamed, giving Annie a quick hug. Joey poked his head out from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion. "Hey, kiddo! That calls for a celebration." He disappeared briefly, then returned with a plate bearing a massive slice of his famous chocolate cake, complete with an improvised decoration of whipped cream stars. As Annie settled into her usual corner booth to enjoy her reward, Rose noticed something different about her today. The girl seemed lost in thought between bites, her eyes repeatedly drifting to her worn backpack. "Everything okay, sweetie?" Rose asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Annie hesitated, then reached into her bag. She pulled out a tattered notebook, its cover decorated with carefully drawn mathematical symbols. "I found this when Mom and I were organizing our things at the shelter," she explained. "It belonged to my grandmother. She used to be a doctor." Rose watched as Annie gently opened the notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting, complex medical notes, and detailed diagrams. "Mom says Grandma was brilliant," Annie continued, her fingers tracing the faded words. "She worked in a big hospital in Atlanta, saving people's lives." "What happened to her?" Rose asked softly, sensing the weight of untold story in Annie's careful handling of the notebook. "We lost touch after Mom and I had to leave Atlanta," Annie explained, her voice growing quieter. "There was a big argument in the family, and then everything fell apart. Mom doesn't like to talk about it, but I remember Grandma's house had this huge library full of medical books. She taught me to love numbers, said they were the language of the universe." As Annie spoke, Rose noticed a familiar name written repeatedly in the margins of the notebook: Dr. Patricia Williams, Atlanta General. The name tugged at something in her memory, like a half-remembered dream. She was about to ask another question when Beth arrived, looking more hopeful than she had in weeks. "I got a second interview," Beth announced, sliding into the booth beside her daughter. "The accounting firm downtown. They actually looked at my qualifications instead of just seeing." She trailed off, but her smile remained bright. "They want to see me again tomorrow." The diner's regulars, who had become invested in Beth's job search, quickly gathered to offer congratulations and advice. Mrs. Wilson insisted on lending Beth her lucky blazer for the interview, while Mr. Thompson, who knew someone at the firm, promised to put in a good word. As the impromptu celebration continued, Rose found herself drawn back to Annie's notebook. The girl was now showing Joey's son some of the mathematical formulas her grandmother had written, explaining them with remarkable clarity. "City, it's like a puzzle," she explained. "Each number has its place, just like ingredients in a recipe." The evening wore on, and the diner filled with its usual dinner crowd. Rose moved between tables, taking orders and refilling coffee cups, but her mind kept returning to that name in the notebook. Dr. Patricia Williams. Why did it sound so familiar? Later, as she was cleaning up after the rush, Rose overheard Annie helping another customer's child with homework. "My grandma always said that math is like a universal language," she explained patiently. "It doesn't matter where you come from or who you are, 2 + 2 always equals 4. Watching Annie, Rose could see glimpses of the brilliant woman who had shaped her early years, the grandmother whose legacy lived on in this bright young girl who refused to let circumstances dim her light. The way Annie explained complex concepts, her natural ability to break down problems into manageable pieces, her patience with those who struggled. These were the marks of someone who had been taught by someone extraordinary. As the night drew to a close, Annie carefully packed away her grandmother's notebook, treating it like a precious treasure. What she didn't know was that this connection to her past would soon become the key to her future. The name that had caught Rose's attention would prove to be more than just a coincidence, but rather the first thread in unraveling a story that would change all their lives forever. Over the next few weeks, the evening shift at Jerry's diner took on a new rhythm. Annie would appear around 6:30, just as the dinner rush was winding down. Some nights she came alone, other times with her mother, a quiet woman named Beth who carried herself with dignity despite the visible weight of her struggles. Rose noticed how Beth would try to decline the offers of food at first, her pride wrestling with necessity. "At least let me help clean up or something," she'd insist, but Rose would hear none of it. "You just focus on finding work," she'd say, sliding a plate of hot food across the table. "This is what neighbors do." The other staff members began to warm up to their regular visitors. Joey, the cook with the gruff exterior, started experimenting with new recipes just to keep things interesting. He'd beam with pride when Annie would declare his latest creation the best thing ever. Even Mr. Chen, the owner who usually kept to himself in the back office, began leaving yesterday's pastries in a box by the kitchen for anyone who might need them. One particularly cold evening, Rose was wiping down tables when she overheard Annie helping an elderly customer read the menu. The old man had forgotten his glasses, and Annie was patiently explaining each special, adding her own recommendations with the confidence of a seasoned food critic. "The meatloaf is really good," she explained, "but on Thursdays, they make this amazing pot pie that tastes just like my grandmother used to make." The sight of this young girl, who had so little herself, helping others stirred something deep in Rose's heart. During quiet moments, she'd watch Annie doing homework at the corner booth, textbooks spread out across the table. The girl had an obvious talent for numbers, solving complex math problems with ease while munching on French fries. Word about Annie and Beth spread through the diner's regular customers. A truck driver who stopped in every Tuesday began accidentally ordering too much food, insisting that the extras would just go to waste if Annie didn't help finish them. Mrs. Wilson, a retired teacher who came in for breakfast and stayed through lunch, started bringing extra school supplies that were just collecting dust in her house. But not everyone was supportive. Rose overheard the whispers from some customers, saw the disapproving looks when Annie and Beth would come in. One evening, a man in a business suit loudly complained about enabling people who should be helping themselves. Before Rose could respond, Joey emerged from the kitchen, his imposing figure and stern expression sending a clear message. The man quickly paid his bill and left, leaving his half-eaten meal behind. That night, after the man left, Beth broke down at the corner table. "Maybe he's right," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I've tried everything. 7 interviews this week and nothing. I used to be an accountant, you know. Had my own office and everything. Now I can't even get a call back." Rose sat down beside her, sliding a cup of tea across the table. "Look at your daughter," she said softly, nodding toward Annie who was helping Joey organize the spice rack in the kitchen. "That girl hasn't given up, and neither should you. Something will come through." As autumn deepened into winter, the diner became more than just a place for meals. It became a haven, a spot of warmth and hope in a world that often seemed cold and indifferent. Regular customers started leaving messages with Rose about job openings they'd heard about. Beth kept a small notebook of leads, each page filled with possibilities. Annie's presence changed the atmosphere of the entire diner. Her laughter bounced off the wall tiles, but curiosity sparked conversations between strangers, and her resilience inspired everyone around her. She had a way of making people forget their own troubles, if only for a moment. One evening, as Rose watched Annie teaching Joey's teenage son how to solve algebra equations during his break, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about feeding a hungry child anymore. They had all become part of something bigger, a small community coming together to lift each other up, One meal, one smile, one moment of kindness at a time. Little did Rose know that the biggest surprise was yet to come, and that Annie's presence in their lives would lead to a revelation that would change everything. But for now, in the warm glow of the diner's lights, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the sound of friendly chatter, they had found something precious. A family pieced together by chance and held together by love. The young girl hesitated at the diner's entrance, her hand gripping the door handle so tight her knuckles turned white. Rose gently placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the slight trembling beneath the thin jacket. "It's okay, sweetheart. Come on in where it's warm." Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions wrapped around them like a warm blanket. A few regular customers glanced their way, but most were too absorbed in their own meals to pay much attention. Rose led the girl to a quiet booth in the corner, away from the curious eyes and whispered conversations. "I'm Rose," she said, sliding into the seat across from the girl. "And I'm thinking you look like someone who might enjoy our famous mac and cheese." She kept her voice casual, trying not to spook the clearly nervous child. The girl's eyes darted around the diner, taking in every detail as if planning escape routes. I'm Annie," the girl finally whispered, her fingers nervously playing with the paper napkin in front of her. The name came out soft and uncertain, like she wasn't sure she should be sharing it. Rose noticed how Annie's eyes kept drifting to the plates of food passing by their table. Without waiting for further conversation, she stood up. "You stay right here, honey. I'm going to fix you up something special." In the kitchen, Joey the cook raised an eyebrow as Rose grabbed a clean plate. "Don't start," she warned him with a look that could melt steel. Joey just shrugged and turned back to his grill, but she caught the slight smile on his face as she loaded the plate with a generous portion of mac and cheese, adding a side of crispy chicken tenders and some steamed vegetables. "Can't send it out looking like that," Joey called over his shoulder, reaching for the garlic bread warming in the oven. He added 2 thick slices to the plate, along with a sprinkle of fresh parsley on top of the mac and cheese. "Presentation matters," he winked. When Rose returned to the table, Annie's eyes grew wide at the sight of the steaming plate. She sat perfectly still, hands in her lap, as if afraid to reach for the food. "It's all yours," Rose encouraged, sliding the plate closer. "And look what else I found." She produced a large cup of hot chocolate, topped with whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. The first bite seemed to break a dam. Annie ate carefully but steadily, each forkful measured and deliberate, like someone who knew too well what it meant to go without. Rose busied herself with wiping down nearby tables, keeping a protective eye on her young guest, while giving her space to eat in peace. Between bites, Annie's story began to unfold in small pieces. She and her mom had been staying at the shelter 3 blocks away for the past week. They'd come from the city, looking for a fresh start after her mom lost her job. The story came out in fragments, between sips of hot chocolate and careful bites of chicken. "Mom's been going to job interviews," Annie explained, her voice growing stronger as she relaxed. "She's really smart and works hard. She just needs someone to give her a chance." The pride in her voice when she spoke about her mother made Rose's heart ache. As the evening wore on, other staff members began their closing routines. The cook started cleaning his grill, and the busboy collected salt shakers for refilling. Through it all, Rose kept finding reasons to stay near Annie's table, refilling her hot chocolate and offering gentle conversation. When Annie finally finished eating, she sat back with a content sigh that made Rose smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting Rose's with a directness that hadn't been there before. "Nobody's been this nice to us since." Her voice traveled off, but Rose understood. "Listen here," Rose said, pulling out her order pad and scribbling on it. "This diner's open 24/7, and I work the evening shift most days. If you ever need a warm meal or just a place to sit for a while, you come see me, okay?" She slid the paper across the table. It had her name and work schedule written on it. Annie carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her jacket pocket like it was a precious treasure. As she stood to leave, she hesitated, then quickly wrapped her arms around Rose's waist in a tight hug. Before Rose could react, Annie had darted toward the door, pausing only briefly to wave goodbye. Rose watched through the window as Annie disappeared into the night, her small figure growing smaller until she turned the corner toward the shelter. The diner felt different somehow, warmer, more purposeful. Rose knew she had just crossed a line between being just another waitress and becoming something more, though she couldn't have explained exactly what that meant just yet. The evening shift at Jerry's Diner was like any other, filled with the familiar clinking of coffee cups and the sizzle of burgers on the grill. Rose, a waitress who had spent the last 5 years memorizing every crack in the warm linoleum floor, moved between tables with the grace that comes from long practice. The small Tennessee town had taught her that every customer had a story, but tonight would bring one that would change her life forever. The autumn wind was picking up outside, sending leaves dancing across the parking lot. Through the steamy diner windows, the neon "Open 24/7" sign cast a warm glow that made the place feel like a lighthouse in the growing darkness. Rose had just finished serving a plate of apple pie to Mr. Thompson, one of their regulars who always sat at the counter, when she noticed something unusual. A young girl, probably around 12 years old, stood outside, her face pressed against the window. She wasn't just passing by. She was watching the plates of food with such intensity that it made Rose's heart squeeze in her chest. The child's dark curls were neatly braided, but her clothes told a different story. A jacket too thin for the October chill, and shoes that had clearly seen better days. The dinner rush was beginning to slow down, and Rose found herself drawn to the window more and more. She watched as the girl would step back whenever customers came in or left, trying to make herself invisible. But she never left completely, her eyes following every steaming plate that Rose carried past the window. Inside the diner, the usual sounds continued, the cook calling out orders, the ding of the bell when food was ready, old Mrs. Chen complaining that her coffee wasn't hot enough. But Rose's mind kept drifting to the little girl outside. She'd seen her fair share of people down on their luck. This was a truck stop diner, after all, but something about this child was different. "Order up," called Joey from the kitchen, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Rose grabbed the plates, a classic meatloaf special and a side of fries, and delivered them to table 6. As she passed the window again, she saw the girl unconsciously lick her lips, her eyes fixed on the steaming food. Rose knew the diner's policy about non-paying customers. Her boss had made it clear enough times, especially after the incident last summer with the group of teenagers who'd run out without paying. But as she watched the young girl hugging herself against the cold, those rules seemed less and less important. The sky had turned a deep purple, and the temperature was dropping fast. Rose could see her own breath fogging up the window as she cleared tables near the front of the diner. The girl had been there for at least an hour now, occasionally walking up and down the sidewalk to keep warm, but always returning to that same spot. Making up her mind, Rose headed to the break room and grabbed her worn denim jacket. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her back, some curious, some disapproving, as she walked toward the door. The bell jingled as she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. The girl startled at Rose's approach, ready to run, but something in the waitress's gentle smile made her stay. Up close, Rose could see the intelligence in those young eyes, mixed with a wariness that no child should have to carry. The girl's fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of her jacket sleeve, but she held Rose's gaze. It was in that moment, standing in the parking lot of a small-town diner as trucks rumbled past on the nearby highway, that Rose felt something shift in her heart. She didn't know it yet, but this meeting would set in motion a chain of events that would touch not just her life, but the lives of many others in ways she could never have imagined. The neon signs hummed above them, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the passing cars. Rose took a deep breath of the cool night air and spoke the words that would change everything. "Would you like to come inside? I think we might have some extra mac and cheese that needs eating."